Good afternoon, and welcome to the third installment of the So Now What series. Today's topic is the future of mobility. For the past 11 years, the ULI Columbus District Council has convened leaders in our city to address major issues facing it, including future population growth, our transportation system, and public spaces. ULI's mission is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land in creating and sustaining thriving communities worldwide. The positive impact that real estate investment, development, and planning can have on developing equitable, sustainable, and resilient communities is critical to understand, particularly considering the challenges of today. ULI Columbus will continue to gather industry experts to gain an understanding of the evolving real estate industry's response to these challenges and gauge sentiments about how the current crisis is affecting various sectors, organizations, and our communities. To start today, I'd like to thank our annual sponsors. This webinar is free to all thanks to the ongoing support of our annual sponsors and our ULI membership, and thank you to all. I would also like to thank Joanna Pinkerton and Sandy Doyle-Ahern for two of the ULI Columbus Governance Committee members for participating in today's discussion. I'm excited to hear what they have to say about the future of mobility in Columbus. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to today's moderator, Gail Saunders, founder and CEO of the Saunders Company. Thank you, Gail.
Thank you so much, Keith. I'm very excited to be able to join you today for this discussion. As Keith said, I am Gail Saunders, CEO of the Saunders Company, and we are a public relations firm located right here in Columbus, Ohio. My connection to mobility is the many big brand clients with whom I work really focus on moving people from point A to point B. I work with Celebrate One, really how you see the need for people to be able to move for housing, health, and other needs. I work with Link Us and the great dynamic, important work that's going to bring to the community. So mobility is part of what we do in the connections that we work with our clients. And so I am really excited today that we have two of the most dynamic, powerful leaders, not only locally, but nationally in this space, who are going to walk us through and talk to us about the importance of mobility and its role in the community's resilience and its interconnection between equity, housing, social infrastructure, workforce, business, and more. So we want to get right at it. And so we're really excited to have Joanna Pinkerton, President and CEO of CODA. By the way, CODA is always noted as one of the top transit agencies in the nation. And of course, Sandy Ahern, who is President of Powerhouse Civil Engineering Firm, EMHNT. So welcome. We are so glad you're here with us. I'm going to start with you, Joanna. First, let me just say a shout out to CODA because you have done an enormous job in keeping our community transit and mobile during these challenging times. And you've been using data to really help drive your decision making. So shout out to CODA for that. If you could just give us a little bit about, we know who you are at CODA, but a little bit about yourself for a brief introduction.
Well, thank you, Gail. Appreciate you giving us a shout out. Our team members, more than 1,100 people who've been at work every day during the pandemic, certainly deserve a shout out. I, as the president and CEO, am really humbled and proud to be part of this team. And I think it's worth noting, since we have an audience, we were just awarded the #1 transit system in the nation this month. This is actually the second time in 3 years, and that's never been done before. That's a testament to our employees and also to our community, who understands that what we do has to improve, has to expand and be more integrated into our planning processes. Have an interesting background. Never thought I'd be running a transit company as a CEO. Started out in engineering. Actually, I think that's where Sandy and I met maybe a few decades ago. I won't admit how long ago. But our engineering journeys took us in similar directions, where now we get to use our IQ and also our EQ to connect our engineering skills and our understanding our infrastructure, our public infrastructure, and how it should also be connected to our social and economic infrastructure. I'm on the journey of a lifetime and doing really well. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Thank you. And Sandy, who seems like she's been your partner in crime for a number of years. Sandy, we just want to give you acknowledgement for your tireless work on a number of important initiatives in this community, from housing to mobility to workforce. And so if you can tell us how you're doing and give us a little bit about your background as well. We can't, we need to, there you go.
I just didn't get unmuted. I'm not sure. Anyway, I took care of it. We're good.
Thank
you, Gail. I appreciate the introduction. Thank you to Keith and for everybody being on the call. For those of you who know me, I'm a pretty social person, so not getting to see you in an audience is always sad to me, but it is great to be able to see some of you in the little video screen, so I'm glad to see you and be with you. So I'm doing fine. I'm doing well. It's been obviously, as for all of us, an incredibly difficult time. It's been an interesting space for us to be in because unlike some other companies, but like CODA, we have been considered as essential. And so all of our workforce, particularly our field workforce, I'm very sensitive to the fact that they have been out every single day. Even when we were able to send our other employees home, they were out. And I am very, very sensitive to that, but we are doing really well. With regards to this topic and just getting a chance to be part of it, I do appreciate this because this topic, particularly around mobility, you cannot take it alone. You have to realize the intersection between mobility, economic development, job creation, poverty, all of this is interrelated. And as I was briefly saying to Gail in the beginning, I'm not naive enough to think that I have the ability to move that needle on every topic at all times, but I do think we collectively have the ability to move the needle here locally in our region, and that we have to work really, really hard to do that. We're in a crisis, and I get that and I acknowledge that, but I am not going to let it stop me from frankly pushing even harder. I think it is a little bit the old adage of don't let a good crisis go to waste. This is the time for us to really push for positive change for the community. And I guess I think I need to give a shout out to Joanna here too, because if you really realize what CODA has had to do over the last year, it is phenomenal. And I'm not saying that just because she's a friend. I'm saying it because we absolutely need strong leadership in our institutions like CODA in the community right now. And with strong leadership, I think we can really push for change. So I'm appreciative of being part of the discussion today.
Well, thank you. And thank you both for that and giving us background about your journeys. And so it is a tough time, but as you mentioned, we still have to make sure that we're doing the work to continue to move us forward. And so when you think about our region is growing. We're expected to grow by 1 million people by the year 2025. And you think about poverty and think about mobility and workforce and all of those pieces and parts, think about how and where we grow. It really is critical to our region's success. And we are at a critical point in time here. So I'm going to start with you, Joanna. As you think about that growth and where we are and where we're headed, what is the impact of mobility and the importance of that to this growth?
Gail, I'm glad you asked the question in the way that you did. I think those who are interested enough to be on this webinar likely get this, but I do think that it's all of our collective responsibility to be evangelists and have this conversation, because how we choose to build out our housing, our commercial development, our livable spaces, and how we integrate various mobility services as that population growth occurs is going to determine the quality of life in the region for generations to come. And we've had great economic success over the past decade. We are projected to continue to have economic success, but there is a serious disparity between who has access to that economic success at the moment. And so we have to reimagine public infrastructure to make sure we support that growth and that high quality of life. And I'm sure most people, particularly this audience, is very familiar with the Insight 2050 work that was led by ULI and great leadership, which has led to where we are now, which is corridor planning. And so interestingly enough, here, instead of just running a transit authority, which we still have to do every day, and it does take up a lot of time, we are absolutely committed to looking at 10, 20, and 30 years out to make sure that the planning we're doing allows for reconnecting our spaces. So Columbus, much like many Midwestern towns, is largely oriented around our interstate system, interstates that literally tore neighborhoods apart. And it's time to repair and reconnect neighborhoods and make sure that we're looking at the outcomes of our mobility systems, because the best spaces and the best places work better when the mobility system is integrated. So you're going to see a real big shift in our ability to plan how we're thinking and who we're working with when we're making investments in the community. And they will be really focused on upward economic mobility. Sandy hinted at that the housing, mobility, and economic development conversation has to address our poverty rate in this community.
Well, you touched on some corridor initiatives, and you talked about that. So big initiatives underway, and I know CODA and Morpsey and the community is engaged in that. Can you talk about Link Us, because you touched on that corridor initiative, and align that to that need to make sure that we're planning appropriately and intentionally across all of those big platforms, equity, workforce, being intentional about that planning.
So the Link Us initiative is centered around how we can leverage partnerships, both with the private sector, the development sector, and the federal government, where there will be dollars available in the future for us to leverage and rebuild out some of our transportation systems. Those of us in the industry, we already know that expanding the highway system is not an option, can't afford it, can barely maintain it as it is. And it's not equitable. It leaves a lot of people out of the system. So the Link Us corridor, we currently are working with major partners on a Northwest corridor initiative. CODA also committed to the regional partners that we can do this concurrently. We don't have to do one corridor at a time, or we'll take too long to get there. We've also launched the East corridor and the West corridor. I'm very grateful to be in the very early phases of that, where we're focused on community engagement. So reaching people who live in the communities, people who don't have access to jobs, and people who want to be part of the conversation as their community grows, as people enter into the community. So that's where we are right now with the East and the West. The Northwest corridor is advancing much more rapidly just because of all of the planned growth that's already been identified along that corridor. And these are plans that we tend to engage more private sector participation and get their input. But a goal for us is to literally have information available to the federal government as early as next year, so that we can put ourselves in line to draw down significant federal funds to help offset the cost of this type of capital improvement. When you look at cities like Denver, Charlotte, Austin's a good one, Seattle and LA, I think we all know their stories. They did not plan necessarily like this and as we are before the growth occurs, and they're now working to address it after the fact, which makes it much more expensive. They have incredible mass transit programs going on in their communities that tie workforce development, access to jobs, and affordable housing to the mobility options which their communities will build out. I think we can do that now.
Thank you, Joanna. And you talk about our ability to do that now. It leads me to a question for Sandy, and that is when you talk about our growth, and recently Morpsey released a regional study about housing. And so Sandy, can you give us your takeaways from that report, but also let's talk about what that means in terms of affordable housing, its connection to mobility, it's reconnecting to spaces, as Joanna kind of alluded to. Can you touch on that for us, Sandy?
Yeah, thanks. So I guess it's one thing I'd like to point out, Central Ohio is a really interesting place in the sense that if you really think about it, we actually don't have any specific natural barriers to construction. We're not bound by mountains on one side. We don't have an ocean or a big lake. We really don't have anything that stops us from kind of growing sort of exponentially in a continued sprawl kind of way. And so we have to be, I think, extra diligent about that. We need to be more thoughtful in our planning process to recognize that we aren't barricaded by anything. And so as we continue to grow, we want to be cognizant of that. So, the MORPC regional housing study, I appreciate you mentioning that, Gail. I'm not going to point it out as the only thing. I mean, we have done a tremendous amount of studying of this region, and I certainly respect that, and I certainly understand it. I know that I'm not alone when I say, though, there are many of us that are really ready to stop talking about understanding the problem and really focusing more on changing the trajectory. So to try to tie it a little bit closer to what you're asking, Gail, you can't understand mobility and housing as well as you think you do if you don't understand the disparity situation that has occurred. And the reason that is really, really important, for some of us, maybe it's an empathy problem and we're concerned about people. But if you're not, then you should be concerned about economic development, because you cannot continue to have great economic development without having a great way for people to get to work and a great place for people to live. And so when you begin to layer all these things one on top of the other, what you really come to find out is, while we do have a highly educated, opportunistic workforce here, we also have people on the margins that truthfully are not getting those chances. So when Joanna talks about corridors and I'm talking about housing and we're talking about trying to interconnect those things, it really is with the intention of creating a more level playing field for everybody. The other thing to understand about this is, when we talk about opportunity, equity, things like that, they should not take that as being pushed out. They should not take that as someone else is going to get a better chance than me. This is really truly about creating a better level playing field for all people in the community. So to get to the nuts and bolts, what we're really talking about is where things get difficult, and that's policy change. We have a situation with housing in particular where we actually are so far behind in housing units that to talk about only affordable housing actually misses the full picture. We have an issue across the market with housing. One of the effects that is occurring, though, is because there is a limit on how much available housing there is, people are actually renting in some cases down. So what do I mean by that? It means basically that when you have a low supply of a network of housing, people who can actually afford something more will actually rent down because they can. They might find a nice place, they save a little bit of money, they use that money then for other expendables. And what that's doing is you get this domino effect, is it actually is making it harder for people who can't afford to rent up to be able to find a place to live. So this problem is relatively complicated. I will say that the MORPC housing study, I think, did a very, very good job of laying out the problem, recognizing there is an equity lens that is really critical to this. And so we have some really good toolboxes available to us. What we're going to need now is change at the local government level. And it's not just in Columbus, it is across the suburbs. And that's where the rubber's really going to meet the road on pushing to try to expand our opportunities. I can talk all day long about this, Gail, so I'll stop right there.
Oh, I think that's wonderful. You and Joanna have both said reimagine our work and how we reimagine it. And I love the conversation around let's stop talking and let's move to action, and really focused on the policy change. So many studies in our community, we have done a great job of of researching and discovery and all of those things. So we have tools, as you mentioned, to help us move the needle. So can you talk to us about how do we move the needle? I'm just picking up on what you're saying about action. Let's take action. How do we move the needle when we know what to do? We believe we understand where those gaps are. How do we move the needle more quickly than where we are right now?
Yeah, and I'll answer that first, and maybe Joanna would add something, a different lens to it. But I guess what I would say is that we are going to have the will to change, because we know what we need to do. We have the toolkits, we have the ideas, but the will to change is probably, in my opinion, more difficult. And the reason I think that's the case is because you are now getting into the weeds on actually changing the way we function, changing the way the public and private sector interact with one another, and truly coming together to make the change. And I'll give you a quick example of that. So the development community in this area, the housing developers in particular, they're a very good group of people. They are smart. They know what they're doing. They want to work together. They want to be engaged with the community. But a lot of times they face the Nimby Syndrome. They face a lot of negativity. And so for the development industry alone to try to come forward to push for change appears very self-serving. And they know that. And so it needs more than that. We can't do affordable housing or any other kind of housing without a developer. So we can talk all day long about the need, but if no one's going to do it, it won't matter. Right. I feel very confident from a lot of conversations with the development community, one-on-one meetings we've hosted at EMH&T, so forth, that this community is ready and very much interested in policy change. But to make that policy change, they have got to have partners, and those partners are going to have to, in my opinion, come from the private sector and the municipalities. And the private sector largely has to do with jobs. It has to matter to me as an employer that my employees have a place to live. And if I don't care about that, then I'm not going to engage in this topic. It would seem a little foolish to not engage in it, particularly if I'm interested in economic development. Mm-hmm. The public sector change is going to be critical because, frankly, it is a lot of the public sector planning and zoning policies, permit review policies, inspection policies that need to be considered. And I think for us to really do this, we have to put aside that anyone's being criticized. This is not about criticizing the development community or criticizing public officials or whatever. This is about truly recognizing that if we want to be the most prosperous city in America, which we have said we're interested in being, then we have got to really put our money where our mouth is. I would hope that the next step is that the municipalities in the region are willing to sit down with the development community using the MORPC study as its lens to dig into what it's willing to do. I will say that I'm disappointed, frankly, and a little sad that all this effort went into this study and there is yet to be a community that has signed off on doing anything about it. I'm trying to be gracious about that. I get that there's a pandemic. I get it. I know there's a lot happening and we're all, trying to get through managing our lives in a pandemic. But at the same time, I do a lot with homelessness and a lot with people on the margins. And I can tell you that these people are good, hardworking people who legitimately cannot find a place to live. And I cannot use a pandemic as an excuse, because in that case, they truly don't have anywhere to go. So I know I'm throwing a lot on the table, but my goal personally is to continue to bring together the development community and the municipalities to try to push for true change. One last quick comment, and I'll stop here, is we do know that the city of Columbus is getting ready to embark on updating all of their policies around planning and zoning. This is hugely critical. Mm-hmm. If you understand how Columbus functions, our plans are so outdated that everything we do in the city of Columbus is operating by variance. meaning we're working with old rules and regs, we're varying from them and always having to get permission to vary from them. So we've got to update that code in order to be more modernized. And I do believe that for the suburbs to follow suit, Columbus does have to take the lead. They are the 800-pound gorilla. That's my personal opinion about it.
Thank you for that. That's big work for the zoning revisit. And so, Joanna, anything to add to that as we talk about move from talk to action?
Of course. Would you expect me to say no to that?
No, no, not at all. I mean, not at all.
I appreciate that Sandy is willing to have difficult conversations and wrapped up with next steps. And so anytime there's a difficult conversation, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's how we do a better job of providing housing, how we coordinate commercial development with mobility as part of the question. Anytime we do that, and anytime you change, it's going to be difficult for the majority of people to get on board and to understand that we're doing it for the future, for future growth. And so I can share with you two perspectives, one mine as a community leader and someone running an organization in the community, and then also as a peer. So what I'm doing to help this, anytime we're heading into times of change, you have to find the support system. And Sandy mentioned all the various partners that are needed at the housing table. Those same people are needed as part of the mobility discussion as well, because they're integrally linked. And the will to change often comes from fear of being the one to say it or the one to be willing to bring the conversations up. So my internal perspective is we didn't have a choice. We had to do this during the pandemic, and we had to have very near-term and frank conversations about who do we serve right now. If 90% of the workforce can stay at home, then it was pretty clear that we had to serve those most in need and those in crisis. The additional 42,000 people, or families rather, who are now using food assistance for the first time in their life because of the pandemic. And instead of, counting ridership and counting how fast the vehicle's moving or how many wheels, the VMT, the vehicles mile travel, which is normally the design standard, we had to look at non-traditional data sets like where are people getting food? There are 26 Columbus City schools passing out free meals to children. What's the food bank doing? How are the doctors and nurses, janitors getting to the hospitals to make sure that our facilities are open? And so when you look at things through non-traditional data sets, when it comes to mobility or housing, that has helped our conversation be a little easier and people understand the willingness to change. I certainly would not want a pandemic to be the long-term strategy of why we change, but I've seen even our own team at CODA pivot because of being willing to have these difficult conversations. So if we take it to the shortage of housing and how we build new mobility systems, I extrapolate that out to the responsibility and the role that every one of us, whether you're a community leader, whether you're a CEO, whether you're a planner, you have a leadership role in this community. And I said the word before, you should be evangelizing this. You should be the boring person at the neighborhood picnic when we're allowed to have them again, that's droning on and on about how important this is for us to change our way of thinking. And I'm very fortunate to belong to kind of this circle of primarily female friends. And we've taken a commitment, and we call out sexism, racism, and bias when we see it in our own offices and meetings and in project planning, any place we are in the community, because you have to have a support system that says it's okay to have this difficult conversation. And so Sandy getting us to next steps, I think has a lot to do with all of our willingness to say, this is important. And I'll bring up one of the corridors. I think maybe Gail, you were even involved in the conversation. There is a process for all you transportation geeks on the call already know this, of how you check the box to make sure that you have included disadvantaged businesses in your federal planning process. It's an easy box to check.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, I looked at my team and I said, show me the data, gender, orientation, race, ethnicity, hourly wage, professional. Have we really talked to everybody? And the data shows slightly different outcomes than what we expected. So who are we really designing the system for? Is it inclusive? Is it for everyone? And we're going back to the drawing board, and we're going to do more community engagement in the communities where we plan to revisit infrastructure. And why is that important? Because this was already done once. It was done back in the 50s, in the 60s, when all of the policies were written, and it was a homogenous group that made all of those decisions. And so now is our time to get it right, to do the policy change, but we have to support one another. Someone has to be the person willing to make that tough call and say, I want to revisit this. And I think we all have the right to kind of raise that yellow flag when it comes to project planning. Our corridors, I want to make sure everyone is really clear that this is not about just putting higher capacity transit along certain corridors. It is looking at the land use planning, like Sandy mentioned, the zoning code. It's also looking at personal mobility devices, because you don't take a bus or a high capacity advanced rapid transit vehicle to the door of your building.
Right.
In big cities, at some point you walk, you bike, you hop in some other shared service. So these corridor studies are really impressive to see how holistically they're looking at the livable situation as opposed to just designing a higher capacity transit system. We could do that with our eyes closed, but our team is committed to making sure we do much more than that.
Powerful conversation, powerful actual ways to move the needle from here to there. When you talk about the will to change, what we've heard from both of you, Sandy and Joanna, is, sometimes that fear and lack of courage to speak up. So having a support group, a support system, someone in the room who supports that is very critical. And so reconnecting our spaces, I keep going back to that, such a powerful commentary. When we think about how we've been forced to change during this pandemic, you both talked about that. It's forced us to think differently. It's forced us to change the way we move the needle within our organizations, change the way how we show up. Most often for the better, because we've really had to figure out solutions to get our people to continue to do the work. And so how do we take the learnings from this pandemic? We're not going to be in this pandemic forever, but while we're in it, we still have to plan ahead and look 10 years down the road. So talk to us about that importance of driving that will to change, the learnings that we've had, the being nimble that we've had to really strengthen that tool in our toolbox during this pandemic, and taking that to make sure that we are staying focused on plans for the future to make sure that we are inclusive, the equity lens, and driving that even more so.
So that's a great, I'm really glad you brought this up. And for those of you on the call, you should know that this is truly a conversation. We did not have all these questions planned out. So I always enjoy these discussions a lot better. So thank you. I think there's something we have to remember, and I know it's hard to remember because it feels like 15 lifetimes ago, but less than a year ago, we were sitting here. If we had had this meeting, we would be talking about nobody can find employees, really low unemployment rate, booming economic development, worrying about how we're going to get everybody to jobs because the roads were congested, to Joanna's points earlier about highways. Even for myself, a year ago, in the meetings I was in a year ago, we're figuring out how in the heck we were going to deal with overcapacity highways to get people to jobs. And so I guess I think two things about this. Number one, I think we're going to be back there. maybe for my own mental well-being, I have to believe that we are, because I don't think we can all operate this way forever. So with the idea that we will power through this pandemic, we have no reason to believe that this region will not go right back to where it was. There might be a delay, it might shift a little bit, but if for those of you who are not aware, One Columbus just got recognized as the #2 economic development entity in the United States. And that is not something that is just handed easily. That is a ton of work. So if you believe we have a certain amount of momentum that will pick up after this is behind us, then what we believe is we still have a great source of water, which means we have companies that are going to want to come here. We still don't have major natural disasters, so it means companies are going to want to come here. We still have huge growth opportunity in the landscape for companies to come here. They're going to come. We're going to need the mobility options that Joanna talked about. We're going to need the housing. So if I think that way, and then I layer on what has happened in the pandemic, we have got to recognize the equity lens that we've been talking about is more prominent than it's ever been. That is really sad that it took George Floyd and a pandemic to do the things that we have been talking about for years and years and years, and nobody was really listening. So I can judge that all day long and be sad about it, but at the end of the day, it's finally here. So now that that's the case, I would hope that those of us on this call in some way touch this industry. Maybe a little bit different way, but we're all in it in some capacity. We know that this is a great region to be in. We know it is, and we know it's going to come back. My hope is that the lessons learned through the pandemic aren't about whether everybody's going to work from home. No disrespect, but I don't really care. To me, that's not a thing. That is all about how you manage your business. Businesses may choose or not choose to do that. What really matters is that as we emerge from it, no matter what your workplace looks like, that we are reaching into our community to create better equity for people. So honestly, Gail, like I said, a year ago, I don't think we'd be talking about that. But now that we are, I'm hoping we're adding it to the daily part of the conversation. So as we make planning decisions, roadway decisions, mobility decisions, employment decisions, planning and zoning decisions, that we are doing it with a much more equitable lens, because that is truthfully what is right. It's just simply what's right.
It's hard to follow Sandy, but she nailed it. Actually, I feel like she was reading CODA's new strategic plan. Of all of our guiding principles, centered in the middle is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I do think that we all have a responsibility. I referenced this before. We all have a responsibility to say, is this being done through the lens of equity? I've been in transportation engineering the majority of my life. That was never a conversation before, because we did not think about who was being left behind. We did not correlate the economic development component, which is massive success on one end, but when you look at it through the lens of neighborhoods and race, we rank 47th and 48th. And those are statistics that should scare all of us, because this region is thriving. We actually have quite a few job opportunities open right now, jobs that cannot be filled, but we have people unemployed. And the two things preventing that connection is how to get there and where do I live. So mobility and housing really comes back to making sure that we have, again, the physical infrastructure to support the social and economic infrastructure. And I think we all have a personal responsibility to ask that again. I can remember at one point in my career, I used to have an LRFD steel manual on my shelf. Sandy probably knows what I'm talking about. And it went with me from job to job. I could look anything up. And I never questioned that I had to refer back to that standard. And now, at least in my organization, in any meeting I am involved in, and any time I talk, I have committed to asking the same question about equity and economic success, because it's not in a manual yet, and it should be.
I'm going to add one last quick thing, Gail, if that's okay, to what Joanna
Absolutely.
said. And that is, I guess, my ask of everybody here who is on this call, because again, I think we're in the industry. I think we have to ask ourselves the hard questions as we're working on projects. Do we really need to do what we're asking someone to do right now? Because the problem is, in my opinion, again, I know that I have strong opinions about this, but I live it every day. We are never going to be able to get this under control if we don't find ways to bring costs down. And that is a difficult thing to do when we also have an upward push for better pay for lots of jobs across the world. And that is a really, really important piece. So we have to ask ourselves, what is driving the cost of development up? What is driving the cost of transportation? Why does it cost us so much? And why can't we build affordable housing? Why can't we do better? We cannot subsidize our way out of this. We also cannot nonprofit our way out of this. This is going to be about the public and private sector coming together to find ways to work better and more efficiently. And if anything has taught us anything during this pandemic, we're all supposed to be more efficient. We're all supposed to have figured out how to work in these very odd circumstances. We are going to have to look at policy and how we do things. And I do think it's important. We get stuck in our ways. We get stuck in what the manual says. We get stuck in, well, this is how we've always done it. And so if we keep that mindset, we will never make policy change. And it's going to be very painful for many of us in the community to have to do things differently. We can still approve plans. We can still approve projects. We can still bring costs down and do it safely and well and with an eye to quality, but not be redundant and drive cost up in a way that it's just because that's how we've always done it. So I'm hopeful with planning and zoning policy change going forward that is a very clear place we can start in this community and continue to be vocal about moving the needle as Joanna's solving the world of mobility in her space.
Thank you so much. We could go on and on, but we have so many questions from the participants. And so I want to make sure that we get to their questions. And then we may have a little bit of time on the back end for you to share how people can support your efforts. So I'm going to start with Kathleen Fox. Her question: could you please talk a little more in detail about the difference between growth and prosperity and how Central Ohio can foster both? Do you want to take that, Sandy? First?
Sure. Yeah. So that is an excellent question. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I have been asking that myself of quite a few people. I guess the best way that I could tell you that I believe it is being interpreted is that growth is being interpreted using the metrics you would generally expect. Numbers of jobs, land area developed, available housing units, the basic metrics that you would already be familiar with. Prosperity is a much different and much more difficult question to answer because, as you can imagine, everybody views the word prosperity quite differently. What we do know are two things. One, we have put it out there in this community that we want to be the most prosperous region in America. So now there are people looking at us and asking us to define what that means. Number two, there are people in this community that will tell you that that is the most difficult thing they've ever heard, and they don't believe that prosperity will ever come their way. And so we have to figure out what it means, because if it's going to have purely a lens of economic development, then prosperity is relatively easy to measure because it will look much like growth measurements. What I already said, economic development, job growth, et cetera. If we're going to mean that prosperity truly extends to everybody in the community, then you unfortunately can't help but to get into the social effect of prosperity. And that's where defining it can be incredibly difficult, because you're now getting into people's emotions, you're getting into their opportunities, you're getting into how people feel about the community that they live in. So it is a challenging phrase, frankly, in my opinion. I don't don't think it's bad to have really bold goals, but I still think this community is generally working on how to define prosperity, and we have a lot of work yet to do to figure out exactly what that means.
And I'll just add to what Sandy said about, the word prosperity evokes a lot of different reactions in different people. I do love that it's not been defined as a monetary metric. Rich doesn't mean prosperous. So what I'm really hoping we will focus on is that prosperity, it should be for all. So you should be inclusive and you should be thinking about for all. And to me, prosperity, and I've had, some journeys in my life, it's about removing barriers for people who have barriers. And so when we talk about equity, not equality, we talk about equity because people who have had different backgrounds have different barriers. So those of us who are now sitting in different positions, or those who have never walked a day in the shoes of someone in a difficult life circumstance, needs to be thinking about how they can help remove those barriers so that that person can have the same access to prosperity. I think that's really important.
Thank you. And thank you, Catherine, for that question. Jonathan Barnes has a couple of questions. First, his is, since affordable housing solutions come in the $10,000s and $20,000 and not necessarily in the $100,000s and $200,000s, what are your recommendations to best deal with this? I think you said it earlier, Sandy, not in my backyard, in urban neighborhoods. And then his second question is, how can the development community have a strong voice in anticipating Columbus zoning changes? So 2 different questions there. Joanna, you want to start with the...
I would be glad to start with that because I'm sure Sandy can build on this. I think one thing is that you need a more engaged transit authority. And I know somebody who can help with that. When you look at what's going on in other major cities, like the corridors of opportunity in Minneapolis, Chicago Metropolitan Transit Authority, good friends with the CEO there. Last month, he just announced that they will be part of the development process for housing, affordable housing around transit-oriented development, and they will coordinate investments. That's not a position that we as a mobility provider have ever thought ourselves being in the business of, and we do now. So you're going to see a big shift when it comes to what we think is our responsibility for helping support that type of development, so that the policymakers, the private sector development who needs guaranteed investment concepts will have basically the backbone to build off of. And I think that's a very new approach than you've ever seen in Columbus.
So, I'm going to keep this really quick, but I think that one of the biggest things that was identified about a year and a half ago when we were really deep diving on some of these concerns with the development community was something that's really obvious, but hard to believe we don't do. We really do not have a consistent education system in the world of planning and zoning. And so in the communities, all of our suburbs, city of Columbus, et cetera, let me be clear, people involved in this are volunteers, well-meaning, care about their community, giving of their time. So in no way do I mean to criticize anyone being involved with this, because it's a labor of love. The issue is, though, that because there is not specific education around terminology in development, how things get done, how costs come up, there is very little consistency for even amongst neighborhood area commissions within the city of Columbus, from suburb to suburb to suburb, on what all of this really means. And so education of officials, including the volunteers, and helping them understand what the constraints to development really are, personally, I think would help a little bit with the Nimby syndrome, because NIMBY comes from fear, not understanding, not knowing. I don't realize what's going to happen. I don't want that in my backyard. Does that mean bad people are going to live here? That's human nature. We know that. But to change it, we really do need a better and more consistent way of helping to educate those people in the planning and zoning space, particularly those that are volunteering their time. And then maybe the second question real quick, Gail, the development community having a strong voice. I think Jonathan Barnes asked the question, and I think he's aware that obviously we have run a couple of forums on this already. The goal actually is to regroup the development community and bring them with the BIA and with MORPC. And I think the YWCA is actually going to be a part of this to essentially run a third forum on exactly this topic to see how the development community could in fact support the efforts. I wish we could do it in person because this idea of doing it by video, it makes it really difficult, but we can't wait any longer. So that is actually in the works to try and get pulled together.
Thank you. I'm going to try to get a couple more questions before our time together is up. And this question is from Jody D. She says she believes the Columbus C2P2, the new planning framework, still does not allow accessory dwelling units in the city. Is this an area that could help with the undersupply that we've been talking about?
That's a great question too. I don't actually know the answer to specifically whether it's going to be allowed or not allowed. What we're going to be continuing to look for is opportunities to safely and appropriately find people living situations where costs come down. And right now, under current code, it's going to be incredibly difficult to bring the cost down without considering a wider range of opportunities. So this is one that's probably going to come up in the course of the CP2 work getting implemented. It's a really good question.
And then following up on that is Eliza Pendexter, and she says that's a very interesting question about accessory units. And so her follow-up is, when C2P2 was created, and that was done with the development department and planning effort, it did not change the actual Columbus zoning code administered by businesses. So which would need to be updated to apply the framework recommendations more effectively? That's her comment. So she's excited to hear about zoning changes and that they're on the horizon. So she just wanted to communicate that as part of that question. I want to make sure we've captured all of the questions. A question that our listeners and participants may have is, how can they support these efforts? I know earlier you talked about having the courage to speak up in meetings and doing our part whenever we're in those spaces, but you've talked a lot about what we're doing, how we're changing that focus on equity. How can this group support these efforts and support what you're doing?
Well, I guess I'd say there's two things. I think that on a day-to-day basis, you know, we have some really smart people on this call that are, as I've said a couple of times, are in this space on a daily basis. And I think to the extent that you're able to use your own knowledge and voice to help educate people involved around you, it can be a game changer, but you have to be willing to speak up, number one. Number two, I think on a more sort of obvious way, as the planning and zoning code changes begin to take place and more investigation is done about that, we need to be supportive of that effort. We need to support getting it done in an appropriate but quick way. I don't think we want to sit here 5 years from now wondering when it's going to get implemented. And then the other thing I would say, and maybe it's a little bit of a plug back to the equity lens. Some of you may know I've been involved in some conversations in the community in the last few months around racial issues and so forth, very specifically. And that's not because I'm an expert by any means. And it's not because I haven't had to go on my own very personal and specific journey around improving my knowledge about race and where I can make a difference. You have to choose to do that. This is the idea of, we keep throwing the word equity out there because it's so important, but you have to choose an equity journey. And if you're not willing to do that, then it's really simple to just say, well, that's someone else's problem. And I just think we're at the point in this community where that's just simply not good enough. So if you're interested in trying to help move the needle, spend a little bit of time starting your own journey, and you will see very, very quickly where you can be a difference maker almost on a daily basis.
Thank you,
how,
Joanna.
yeah, I like how Sandy's worded that. I just wrote that down. We each need to choose an equity journey. And to the extent that people on this call today care, you have places where you can connect your personal or your professional skill set in the work you do to the needs in the community. I still am bowled over by the fact that advocates who understood that we need cleaner air, more access to mobility options, and all of the things that come with smarter transportation were the ones who actually led the charge and helped us enroll 58% of employers into an unlimited transit pass program for all employees. You know, everyone from hourly wage workers to white collar professionals in the same office building. No one had ever done that in the nation. Who would have thought that would happen in Columbus, Ohio? So why don't we now take that county-wide or region-wide? So are you advocating and asking your employer to step up and participate in things you believe in that lead to best practices? You know, the air quality one is one, I brought it up because it's on my mind. I am really sad to be part of an industry that now holds another #1 title, #1 source of pollution in the United States for 2 years in a row. Transportation is now the #1 source of pollution. And when it comes to equity, that adversely affects women and minorities more than it does any other group because of how our transportation systems are designed and because of all the tailpipes going past their housing. And so employees here have already started the conversation. We're going to be all low and no emissions at COTA by 2023. But they're already saying, how do I go from low and no emissions to all no emissions by 2035? So use your professional, you know, what you're passionate about, and challenge your peers, challenge your employers to make sure that those things are happening in your workplace as well.
Thank you. Thank you both so very much for the conversation today. Most importantly, for what you're doing to drive change in our community, in the spaces that you're in. And what I take away from so much from this conversation today is that action. And so a saying, we say, get in where you fit in. And so we all have an opportunity wherever we are to take that mantle and drive change in our conversations, pushing the envelope, having the courage to challenge where we can in our spaces. I know that courage piece is very important as we are moving forward in these conversations we're having and the movement that we're having around equity, social change, and what that means to this community. So I know that we are just about out of time. As we close, some parting words from each of you, Sandy and Joanna, 30 seconds each.
Just a huge thank you from me. I never would have dreamed 20 years ago that people would be as geeked out about mobility as I am. So I do like that there is now a forum for people to have conversations. I think we've taken so much for granted for so many years that the systems in place just exist and magically happen, because they don't. They take years of planning, they take funding, and just really grateful operating from a place of gratitude today that people are willing to have these conversations about how to reimagine our communities.
Yeah, and I'll just add, we're going to get through this. Okay, we will. So I think we need to keep our eye focused on the back end of this. Take the things that we've learned and keep them intact, but go back to where we were before we got hit by a freight train and know that we were on a trajectory for this community to grow in a way that could be unbelievable. And we, especially the people on this call who do this kind of work, really can be very influential in doing the right thing. So maybe this was a wake-up call for us to use this pandemic situation and social justice situation to really make us even better. And I have a lot of confidence that we can do that. And I'm going to continue to hopefully work with all of you to make that happen. And Gail, thank you. It's not easy moderating these on Zoom, so appreciate you.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We look forward to the next session that you will have, but just powerful, powerful conversation, very inspiring. And just thank you for your leadership. And we will do what we can to continue to support you in all of your efforts. Thank you, everyone. That's it.
Thanks, Gail.
All right, thanks. Take care.